I feel like I've always had a hard time choosing favorites because I feel like it can change so quickly with different phases of life. But I'm going to talk about some books that have stuck with me. And these are books that I always end up going back to, always end up recommending, books I think everyone should read. So I'll call these my favorite books of all time. And none of them are in this kind. I don't own too many physical books. I know it looks like a lot. Maybe it is a lot. But I don't really have a home at the moment, so I can't really buy books. Well, I do, but irresponsibly. So first, let's see. Venus and Furs by Leopold von Sicker-Masoch. This book is about a man who has this insatiable desire to be enslaved by a woman. The author's name was actually inspiration for the word masochist, which I don't think he was too happy about. And this book is a big example why his name was used to coin the term masochist. The first time I read it, I read the first half in one sitting, and I had to actually stop reading it. So I had to take a break because it was really upsetting me for some reason. And I think what it was the theme of one's soul existence and soul desire in life is for sexual gratification. Like, this man doesn't care about anything but his own sexual gratification in life. And there's just something so depressing to me about that. It ended up being one of my favorite books of all time. Maybe for that reason. How upsetting I found it and how much it impacted me. Because this book is oniony. It's got many, many layers that I don't know if the author even considered. Um, at its core, it's a book about grooming, patriarchy, and it's like, how can a book about male submission to a woman be considered patriarchal? But that's the whole thing, really. It's a man's desire. It's the lengths a man is willing to go to groom women to get what he wants. And I was surprised when I went and looked at reviews of this book, and a lot of people were saying that it was just a fun story about like a man getting his rocks off. And I was really surprised at that because I thought it was one of the most disturbing books I've ever read. And one of the weirdest parts of this book is that it's basically not fiction, it's just the author's real life. Our main character, Severin, who longs to be enslaved by a woman, is actually Leopold von Sager-Masoch. The woman who he ends up being enslaved to, Wanda, is also based on a real person. But you may ask, why is this book so disturbing? And it's just, we're following the perspective of this highly disturbed, obsessive man, Severin. And as we journey with him through his ultimate fantasy of being enslaved by a woman, we end up not being able to differentiate between reality and fantasy. This is all fantasy, right? Leopold Severin's fantasy of being enslaved. But it starts to blend into reality. And since we're following from Severin's perspective, we don't really know what's real or not real. It's a theme that's brought up continuously throughout the book. When we as a reader realize we don't know who Wanda is. Every time she takes her ownership of Severin too far, every time she crosses a boundary, she'll come back and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I just thought that's what you wanted. I was just trying to please you, Severin. I want to be your fantasy." And Severin ends up forgiving her over and over and over again. And it just gets darker and more cruel. So throughout the whole book, there's just this tension of, we don't know who Wanda is, really. We don't know if she's really this cruel mistress. We don't really know if Severin just groomed her into being this, if she's just playing a part, or if she maybe eventually became what Severin was grooming her to become. We don't know any of this. We just know that she has power over him, and she can do anything she wants to him, even kill him. So it's a very tense read. It was a very tense read for me, and it stuck with me. It's a book that I feel like I could reread 100 times and still learn something new from. Another book that I would consider to be one of my favorites of all time is a nonfiction book called Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin. And Andrea Dworkin was a big feminist figure, an activist in the 1970s, and she was considered to be a very controversial figure and was criticized from both sides, feminists and non-feminists. And I think what happened was just a complete misinterpretation of this book, Intercourse, which caused a lot of controversy. So, Intercourse is basically an examination of the inherent misogyny in the act of sexual intercourse. And it's a very sensitive topic. A lot of people, when this book came out, started saying this book was preaching that all sex is rape. And that isn't so untrue. And it's very unfortunate that that's what people ended up knowing Andrea Dworkin for, was this ideology that wasn't even hers. But this book changed my life. It articulated so many thoughts that I've had all my life and didn't know how to articulate. In this book, Andrea Dworkin analyzes different texts of literature written by men, which I found to be very interesting, through the lens of men using sex as a means of power, control, and humiliation of females and women. And she examines the current culture of, she calls it the female humiliation ritual, which it can be seen in mainstream pornography, not niche pornography, but mainstream, the kinds that young children are first being exposed to as a means of learning about sex. It involves the extreme humiliation and violence against women. And Andrea Dworkin does something really fascinating by tracing this back, way back in history, all the way to Joan of Arc, examining, trying to understand why has this act of intercourse been tinged with violence, power, control. It's just fascinating, and it's something that I think everyone should read and decide for themselves how they feel about it. Because Andrea Dworkin's not, in this book, she's not telling anyone what to think. She's just giving examples. She's just laying down the facts. I think Andrea Dworkin can explain her ideas way better than I can. So I highly recommend this book to everyone. It's just a way to open your mind and think about things that maybe you've never thought about, or maybe you disagree with, or it's just eye-opening. So it's one of my favorite books of all time, I would say. Okay, the next book, one of my favorites, is Dracula by Bram Stoker. And I first read this when I was in college, and I immediately loved it. It was the book that made me realize that classics aren't intimidating, or they aren't as intimidating as they may seem. And it's a comfort book for me, I would say. It's just, I could read it over and over again. And there was a time where I would just read it every October because it would just get me in the spooky spirit. You know, it talks about things such as xenophobia and like fear of foreigners. And it's also an examination of feminism at the time, where it was, I think they'd call it the new woman. Women like Mina, more equal to men. So there are ways to read into it, of course. But personally, I just find it to be a nice comfort book. Another book that I want to talk about is Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. And I read this a few years ago, and I went into it thinking it would be just like a fun, dramatic melodrama, shocking, with like incest and violence and stuff like that. That's what I went into it thinking it would be, just like a fun read, fun, disturbing read. This ended up being the first and so far only book that has made me sob while reading. I was kind of shocked because that never happened to me before. It wasn't just crying or tearing up, I was like sobbing during this book. And it's just a completely horrific book, a horrific story. It's not fun at all when I was reading it. I just felt the claustrophobia, the entrapment, the hopelessness. I don't even know how to describe this book. In most basic terms, it's about a girl and her brothers and sisters who are locked in their grandmother's attic, and they must live there indefinitely. They don't know when they're going to be able to leave, and it's a means for them to keep their late father's wealth. So it's a sacrifice that they're willing to make at first, but it ends up being terrible. Why it made me cry so hard was, it was just, and there's a lot of criticism for this book for its cheesiness or its purple prose, and but this book is so heartbreaking. And it's just we follow this young girl's perspective as she loses her innocence. And just what made me sob was I won't spoil anything, but there's just the depiction of this young girl coming to age and having all these desires for life, having all these wants and dreams, and just having absolutely no way to experience any of the experiences that she wants to have in life, and just the utter loneliness that she expresses and the disturbing path that ends up leading her down, and her saying, I had no choice. This life was taken from me, this life that I dreamed of was taken from me, and now all I deserve is this terrible disturbingness. So yeah, I will never reread it, probably, but I recommend it. It's just, well, do I recommend it? Yeah, I think it's good. And I'm just going to talk about one or two more books because I really have to pee. A few books that stuck with me when I read them as like a younger girl. The Hunger Games changed my life. I was obsessed with it when it first came out. I was 12 years old, and it was a book that really got me into reading. Before this book, I was not an avid reader. And even as an adult, looking back on the series, it's so masterful. It's just so good. And also another book that impacted me as a young girl was The Bell Jar, of course, by Sylvia Plath. I think her depiction of depression transcends time. Like it takes place in the 50s or 60s, but it's just so true to the experience of just hopelessness and just depression and just having no will. So, yeah. Okay, the last book I want to talk about is a very, very long book, large, called The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. Anne Rice wrote the Interview with the Vampire series. Love Anne Rice. But I read The Witching Hour and was just completely blown away by it because it was so detailed. And it was a book where you can tell the author really loves what she's doing. She really loves these characters that she made. She really loves the story that she's crafting, and it's in this era where a lot of authors I know feel rushed into completing a book and publishing it. This book, which is like more than 1,000 pages long, really, really takes its time, and you can tell that Anne Rice loved writing it. Maybe she didn't, but that's just the vibe that I get from it because it's so detailed. And I say it reminds me of like old cartoon movies like Snow White or something, where every frame is hand drawn and you cannot detect any little bit of laziness. It's so like intricate and detailed. And you can tell a lot of work is put into it. The Witching Hour follows generation after generation of the Mayfair family, who obviously are connected to witchcraft, and it's just so complex and so layered and so deep. It's a book that, despite its length, I will be reading over and over again. Another comfort book. It's just so fascinating. Really good. I recommend it. I know a lot of people are scared of, or I know a lot of people don't really prefer longer books these days, but it's a good reminder that you can take your time and enjoy the book that you're reading without rushing to the next one, or it's just a way to slow down in a fast-paced life, I guess. But so yeah, obviously there's a lot more books that I could talk about, but I wanted to narrow it down to just a few, and I also really have to pee, so I'm gonna go. Yeah, let me know if you've read any of these or if you have any recommendations to add to the list.